Captured by Candlelight, London, 1933. It was midnight on the 12th of December. The weather in London was absolutely perishing, and an icy wind belted along the Strand. Tilly Dilly and Jimmy Townsend were off to celebrate the end of their first West End run with a jolly good dinner at the Savoy Grill, and their manager had tipped off the press that they'd be on their way. Jimmy wore a good thick coat over his tailcoat and was preparing to hang on to his top hat. Tilly was too glamorous in a buttercup yellow bias-cut velvet ball gown and cashmere coat. The cab slowed down for the cameras as they pulled into Savoy Court, and they alighted with grace and languid movements so that the photographers wouldn't waste too many flashbulbs taking a flattering snap. They'd each served 10 years in the chorus line, honing their song and dance skills, practising out of hours, until Tilly could hold A longer than Jimmy could leap higher than anyone else they knew. While Arthur C. Penshaw was auditioning for his latest review, they had presented their charming interpretation of If I Had a Talking Picture of You. They sang and tapped their youthful hearts out, and when Artie Penshaw saw Jimmy's standing splits sauté, he signed them on the spot. Third on the bill, just after Tallulah Freckleton and her banana dance. The public commented that Jimmy and Tilly were almost like brother and sister. They jogged along together so well. Of course, like many other double acts, that was because they were indeed brother and sister. Dilly was their mother's maiden name. Once they were safely ensconced into the Savoy's modern, sumptuous yet cosy embrace, they gave each other a peck on the cheek and parted. Tilly had been invited to dine at a private table with her good friend, the Honourable Edwin Hewlett, and Jimmy was frightfully pleased to have been invited for cocktails and supper with Noel Coward and a select assembly of friends. At noon the following day they would be off to Chiswick for a family gathering. But for the first time in 6 months they each had 12 hours to spend exactly as they liked. They were both home at their Fitzrovia digs before dawn, but dawn is very late in December. A small number of hours later they had their luggage sent on by cab, bade goodbye to their landlady in Charlotte Street, and walked as briskly as their headaches would allow, crossing Oxford Street to pick up some scarves from Liberty, then down Regent Street, cutting through to Piccadilly to buy tea from Fortnum's for Mother. They picked up the District line at Dover Street, waving to the carefully positioned photographer. After rattling along on the London Underground for 5 minutes, they felt they'd done enough nodding, smiling and autograph signing for the day, so they disembarked at South Kensington and hailed a cab. It was very chilly but not yet snowing at Turnham Green, and Mrs. Townsend had had fires lit in every room to warm the place up for their children's triumphal, if temporary, return to the nest. While they were growing up, they had been accustomed to frost on the inside of window panes, icicles dripping from the bath taps, and wearing their woolly hats and socks in bed. For while no one cared to mention it, it was quite obvious that the Townsends had always been rather short of money, until Tilly and Jimmy had increased their income tenfold overnight. They were about to earn a further bonus. A telegram had been delivered that morning, so after lunch, as they all sat in the parlour sharing news, Jimmy opened it, stood up sharply and clasped his hand to his forehead. "Nothing wrong, I hope, old chap?" asked his father. "Not at all, quite the opposite," Jimmy replied. "It's from Noel and Dougie. We've been offered the best job in the business. 1,000 guineas for one night's performance. We only have to be there for 3 days. We'll be home on Christmas Eve. Johnny can get married to Gertie, and Mother, you can have new carpets." For Jimmy, despite his glamorous new life in the spotlight, still had a sense of proportion. What was important to his family was important to him. Their older brother Johnny, who was not the theatrical type at all, had supported the household by working as a clerk in a middle-sized Chiswick insurance company for 13 years. All he wanted to do was marry his childhood sweetheart Gertie and have a place to call their own. As for the rest of their family, their needs weren't great, but Mother was very tired of covering up the worn patches in the carpet with yet another homemade rug, and Father's work had never sold particularly well. "Not that one Tallulah did last year," cried Tilly, clapping her hands. "Apparently it's an absolute hoot. They keep you hidden. You do your little number on their private stage, Then they all have dinner and you whoosh straight back to London. Exactly, that's the one, but we're not allowed to say a word until it's all finished and we're back home. Apparently the family's somewhat notorious. They're rumoured to have made their fortune by a succession of lucrative marriages followed up with card sharping. What a lark. The family, father, mother, grandmother and Johnny, had gone quiet and were all looking a little serious. "May one ask," said Grandmother Townsend with an affected nonchalance, "the name of this particular family?" "Indeed, Grandmother," said Jimmy, "it's the Daldberry family." There was a gasp, then silence. "All mention of that name," said Grandmother Townsend, "is forbidden in this household." "Oh," said Jimmy, "righto, shan't mention it then. But if Johnny wants to get married and you want a new carpet, Mother, then Tilly and I won't say another word, but we're going there, we're going to take the money." Mr. Townsend, a man of few words and a life spent painting watercolours in his upstairs studio, cleared his throat. "Mother," he said, "that name was forbidden in Father's household. This is my household, and I believe that now is an appropriate moment to tell Jimmy and Tilly of the circumstances surrounding their grandfather's fall from grace. No good can come of its secret these days. Father is dead, and Lord Daldberry died 10 years ago. We must tell the story." His mother turned away from him and looked at the fireplace. He continued, "Jimmy, Tilly, your grandfather James was an adequately wealthy man with a private income but no great intellect. He fell in love with your grandmother here when she was performing on the stage as a jolly fine actress, playing Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Naturally, your grandmother had many admirers, and Lord Daldberry was one of them. Daldberry was very persistent, although your grandmother was happily engaged to be married to your grandfather. Of course, it was later discovered that the cad was already married to a rather sweet, pleasantly dim American heiress whom he kept at home in the country while he ran riot in the city. Lord Daldberry was somewhat irritated that his attempted conquest had failed, and one evening invited your grandfather out to dine. As far as we can ascertain, at the end of a long dinner he lured my father into a card game which was seemingly played in a light-hearted manner, but in which our family fortune was lost. Lord Daldberry accepted signed notes in lieu of payment at the time. My father, I'm ashamed to say, arrived home barely conscious, unable to remember the evening's events. Nothing further was heard for the matter until 7 years after my parents were married. They were living well and happily in Bloomsbury Square, and I was a chubby little child. Daldberry's lawyers arrived one day with the notes and an insistence on their being settled immediately. There was nothing to be done. His money was gone, the house was to be sold, and your grandmother returned to the stage to enable the family to afford the home in which we now reside. There was an artist chappie just setting up his studio who was part of their group. He was American too, and spent his time in London and Paris painting all the society ladies and well-known beauties. Of course he wanted to paint your grandmother, and presented her with the most lovely full-length portrait entitled Captured by Candlelight. Grandmother Townsend interrupted with a long sigh. "Darling," Mr. Townsend said to his wife, "would you go to my bureau and take out the sketch? You can bring it here." "And you can fetch me a large brandy," snapped his mother. Mr. Townsend continued. There was worse to come. There was one more note. Lord Daldberry claimed the portrait. While your grandmother watched, he took out a knife and cut her face from the canvas, rolled it up and took it away with him. I'm afraid my father never recovered from the shame. The frame and the desecrated portrait are hidden upstairs in the attic. One day we hope to restore it. And that, my dear boy, my dear girl, is why the name is so hateful to us. The family reunion had turned into a melancholy affair. Mrs. Townsend joined them. Placing a generous brandy glass on the table by her mother-in-law, she passed the piece of paper to her husband. A study for Captured by Candlelight. The lovely charcoal sketch with its simple lines seemed to glow by the firelight. It warmed up the room again just with its beauty. "Well then, father," said Jimmy, "it would seem to be my duty to earn it back." A week and a bit later, they were on the train out to Buckinghamshire. It was dark by the time they arrived at the station, and they were shown by the chauffeur to an elegant limousine. At the house, they were driven to the back door and escorted through the servants' entrance to the rooms below stairs, where they were given a cup of tea in the staff parlour. "Strict instructions," said Lance the chauffeur, who had introduced himself by means of the communication pipe on the short ride to Dalderbury Hall. "No one is to know you're here, no one, not one person, only us and of course Lord Dalderbury. You're the big surprise at tomorrow's do. You take your meals with us in the kitchen. We'll show you all the servants' passages and stairways, how to find the stage at the far end of the ballroom, and the way up to your bedrooms. You're not married, are you?" "Brother and sister," said Tilly. "Well, I never," said Lance. "Always thought you were sweethearts. Anyway, your rooms next to each other on the 4th floor. They always give me the job of making sure the Christmas act goes to plan. If you want me, get down here, someone will find me. Dinner's at 9, breakfast at 7, lunch is at 12 noon. You can rehearse as much as you like as long as no one hears you. Ballroom's all yours. Guests all assemble for an early dinner. You might be famous, but you're not posh enough to dine with the toffs, so you get back down here for a bit of nosh with the rest of us. Into the ballroom, curtain goes up at 8 on the dot, you do your number, curtain comes down, applause. 2 curtain calls, then you're expected to get yourself down to the drawing room for some polite conversation with the guests. The last of your duties is to follow the whacking great Christmas pudding into the dining room. The lights go off. MacBain, the butler, sets light to the pudding. We all say ooh and ah, get served a bit of pud, retire down here. We eat the pud. MacBain hands you an envelope. I drive you back to the station. Got that?" "Got that," said Tilly and Jimmy, who were accustomed to taking stage directions. "Oh, gracious me," said Tilly on arriving in her bedroom. "It reminds me of childhood." The room was small, barely furnished, and very, very cold. To keep warm, she set up a time step. Jimmy joined in. They soft shoes shuffled along the corridor to Jimmy's room, which was warmer, but only because it was smaller and the fading embers of a small log still glowed in the hearth. "If we stay here," said Jimmy, "we'll die of frostbite. Let's explore." Dalderbury Hall had a complete parallel system of corridors and stairways built into its Victorian immensity. The Dalderburys and their guests would hardly ever have to meet a servant. From the servants' side of the doors, Tilly and Jimmy could see into the main house through mirrored glass windows. They could watch any of the 24 or so house guests walk right past them, then pop out and skip quietly through the warm, brightly painted, velvet-upholstered family side of the house, then dodge back into the dim, plain, secret second-class world when they heard someone approaching. The hall was complex but compact. Each of the magnificent ground floor rooms seemed to have at least 4 doors, some leading to the grounds outside. The guests were assembling in the drawing room, which led into the dining room, which led into the ballroom, at the end of which was a pair of thick gold velvet curtains concealing the stage. Tilly and Jimmy found the stage door, switched on the lights and had a good look round their venue for the following evening. Not expecting to encounter another person, they both jumped when a piano started playing on the other side of the curtain. Someone was tinkling away on the ivories, lightly improvising around the song they were planning to perform. Something came and got me in the spring. Jimmy tiptoed to the edge of the stage and peered round the curtain. "Francis!" he cried as he spotted one of his very favourite people. Francis almost fell off the piano stool in shock. "Oh, chum, don't give a fellow a heart attack," he said. "I'm your accompanist, didn't you know? Shall we have a little run through?" "Absolutely, old boy, absolutely," said Jimmy, as he stared at over 100 portraits hanging on the ballroom walls. "It's blooming cold here, though, isn't it?" Francis said as he blew on his knuckles to keep them warm. "Hope they're setting a good old fire to tomorrow night, or I shall fluff the arpeggios and you'll pull something painful." "Yes, let's give it a go," Tilly agreed. "There's not much to do until dinner, is there?" "Best check where they all are first," said Jimmy. "If they hear us from the dining room, we're toast." They found a doorway into the servants' hallway, which Francis told them he'd nicknamed the underworld, and walked along to the dining room portal. There were 2 footmen one setting the table, one polishing the silverware, and they all made the shh sign to each other. The dining room was adorned with another several dozen portraits, from Elizabethan to modern age, and Jimmy spotted his grandmother's face in one of them. Second row up, 14th from the left, between a Georgian gentleman in a wig and an astonishingly ugly toddler. There she was, in oils, in all her glory, the candlelight on her elegant face. What to do? What to do? They could hear the sounds of glasses clinking, greetings from long-lost friends, which probably hadn't seen each other for at least a fortnight, and enthusiastic conversation from the drawing room next door. "How long before they come in for dinner?" Jimmy whispered. "You've got 10 minutes, said the footman, "but don't get caught. One chap was overheard a few years back, never worked again." They tiptoed back and had a quick run-through of their 3 numbers. A duet, ending with a skillful solo dance from Jimmy. Tilly sang the second, then Jimmy was back for a second duet, followed by a daring dance number. 10 minutes with no applause, perhaps 12 if the audience was generous. Dinner was served, 30 around the table. Tilly, Francis and Jimmy watched them through the mirrored doors. There were plenty of faces they recognised, people with whom they were sociable back in town. How odd to be invisible to them. They left the social buzz behind, made their way along to the underworld's dim passageways, then down the back stairs to the servants' parlour. After a late dinner, no one could eat until the Lord Daldberry had dismissed them for the evening. They retired to the 5th floor, the temperature dropping with each stair they climbed. "Thank goodness the bedrooms are so cosy," Francis announced. "What?" chorused Tilly and Jimmy. Francis had struck lucky, but good egg that he was, voted to give up the only warm room to Tilly, and offered to bunk up with Jimmy to save body heat. Jolly kind of him. On Christmas Eve, the team loitered in the servants' quarters, which were buzzing with visiting footmen, ladies' maids and chauffeurs, all rushed off their feet. With every room taken, there wasn't a lot of time for chatting. The older ones had never heard of them. The younger ones were a little starstruck at first, but once they all noticed that the guests weren't at all stuck up, they got along nicely. Tilly stayed by the range, keeping warm. Jimmy amused himself, trotting along corridors and ducking out of sight, dodging in and out of the passageways. McBain was astonished to see him practising his trademark standing leaps in the dining room of all places, then spiriting himself away as the gong was struck for luncheon. As the sun set, they managed a final run-through while the guests were reading in the library, napping in their bedrooms or chatting in the drawing room. After Tilly's solo, Jimmy skidded on stage quite breathless and excited. "Pay attention, darling," Tilly scolded, as Francis played the introduction. "We mustn't put a foot wrong." It all went smoothly enough, and apart from adding a couple of extra solos to their dance number, they decided to stick closely to their London show routine. Jimmy didn't leap quite as high as usual. "Awfully low beams on this stage," he commented. "A chap could knock himself senseless." Even after all those years, waiting in the wings gave them butterflies. They changed into their costumes and put on their soft shoes to walk quietly through the underground to the stage. Francis was in his socks, as his evening shoes were too noisy for the hard floors. Looking from the side stage spy hole, they could see that the audience had been augmented by a collection of local invitees. The assembly included the vicar, the doctor, a collection of retired military men, Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, one Maharaja and a group of elderly ladies. The last guest was escorted in by Lord Daldberry, a sweet-faced, smiling grey-haired lady who took her seat in the centre of the front row. While Daldberry made a short speech, the usual stuff, Francis took his place at the piano, now hidden behind a Japanese silk screen. "Let the festivities begin," finished his lordship, with his customary lack of originality, and as Francis began to play, Tilly and Jimmy walked onto the stage. The curtain opened and several of the audience gasped. The others whispered, "Who is it?" And a murmur established once again Lord Daldberry had secured the best act in town. Jimmy finished the first number with his dance, to give Tilly time for a quick change with the aid of a hastily appointed upstairs maid, then left the stage to be replaced by his sister. Her broken-hearted love song had the ladies in tears, as they clapped wildly and shouted, "Bravo, bravo, encore, encore!" Tilly glanced into the wings for a signal from Jimmy. He slid into view, holding his tap shoes, and waved to indicate another chorus. As she sang the final lyrics, Tilly gracefully exited to more overwhelming applause, after eliciting emotions the elderly ladies hadn't felt since the previous century, and whispered, "Where were you?" "Explain later," Jimmy whispered back as he took to the stage for the first verse and a chorus during Tilly's quick change into tap shoes. 2 verses, a chorus, another verse, a dance, a final verse. A spectacularly complex finale ended with Jimmy's leap. They took 2 curtain calls to cries of "Jolly well done" and "Good show," and the house lights were raised, and McBain announced, "My lords, ladies and gentlemen, Christmas pudding is served in the dining room." The connecting doors were opened and the crowd started shuffling through into the candle-lit room. The pudding was so large it had to be trundled in on a trolley. The blue brandy flames flickered as it burned away, filling the room with a toffee fruit cocktail aroma. Jimmy and Tilly were invited to cut it open and staff served it to the guests. As a signal it was time for the villagers to leave, McBain turned on the electric lights. The guests turned toward the Dowager Lady Daldberry to bid her good night, and one by one noticed her expression as she stared astonished at the wall. Following her gaze, they saw that 4 portraits were missing. "I've been robbed!" roared Lord Daldberry. As the guests got into a rather heated fluster, one of the assembly, a tall, thin gentleman, stood on a chair, asked for everyone's attention and got it. "Inspector Billingham, Scotland Yard," he said. "Would house guests please move to the drawing room and village residents return to the theatre?" Wasn't a question. Jimmy, Francis and Tilly stayed in the dining room. Billingham smiled at them. "Drawing room, I think. Come with me in a moment." He instructed the guests to make sure the village guests had all written down their names and addresses and finished their pudding before being allowed home. Then he dispatched Lance to fetch Sergeant Whistler from the police house. He stared up at the spaces previously occupied by the 4 frames, the gaps drawing attention to the portrait in the centre, a lovely painting of a lady. "I wonder who she is," he mused. One would almost imagine that the other paintings had been removed just to show it off. "Excuse me, sir," said Bert the footman, who had crept through the staff door, "but we found the library windows wide open. Looks like you'd done a runner, sir." A search of the house ensued, and the 4 paintings were found unharmed in the stair cupboard by Hilda the nursery maid. "No crime appears to have been committed. I think we can restore the paintings to their homes and all repair to ours," Billingham suggested. "I want the fellow caught," Daldberry roared when he heard the news. "Set a trap. He'll be back for them." "I think not, sir," said Billingham mildly, which provoked a further round of roaring. "Just a moment, my dear," said a thin, clear voice with a Southern American accent. The Dowager Lady Daldberry wanted to speak. "Doesn't even know what year it is," muttered his irritable lordship. "Fat lot of use this is going to be." "Go ahead, ma'am," said Billingham. The room fell silent. "Thank you, my good man." "You're Jimmy Townsend, aren't you?" she said, turning to the performers. "I knew you back in the 90s, didn't I? My husband stole your money. I'm so sorry about that. He did it to so many people." She shook her head sadly. "Talking rubbish, nonsense," Daldberry interrupted, and Inspector Billingham raised an authoritative finger to silence him. "That particular Jimmy Townsend was my grandfather, your ladyship," Jimmy told her, and her eyes clouded for a moment as her fading mind tried to catch up with the intervening years and failed. "Yes, indeed. I know your lovely wife, too. She played Titania, didn't she? That's her portrait next door, the lady in the candlelight. My husband stole that too. You should really have it back." "Yes, I shall give it back to you while you're here. What luck you're turning up to sing to us like this." "Now, mother, this really is enough," his lordship blustered. "Billingham, old chap, you can ignore every word. She has no idea what she's talking about." "Now, Aubrey, don't be naughty," she scolded. "I have it all here in my notebook. I listed every single painting my husband stole, every single woman he pursued, and every guinea he cheated out of his friends." She turned to Billingham, smiling gently, and added affectionately, "He was a card shop, you know." She delved into her embroidered bag, picked out a leather-bound book, and handed it to the inspector. "Perhaps you'd be so good as to help me find the owners." The current Lady Daldberry actually dropped a pin, and everyone turned to look. "Firstly, let's get the steps so we can reach down that lovely portrait of Jimmy Townsend's wife." The flabbergasted assembly remained quiet, with collective eyebrows raised. The Dowager Lady Daldberry, the Townsend, Inspector Billingham, and Sergeant Whistler made their way back to the dining room, followed by Bert with the steps. "I find myself wondering how the thief managed to reach the paintings without the steps," Billingham mused, glancing towards Jimmy, who looked at his feet, which were doing a little dance beside themselves. "Still, not to worry, nothing's gone far. And we still seem to have uncovered several 50-year-old crimes. Not bad for a night's work." He thumbed through the pages. "Untangling this evidence could take some years, but it's going to be quite an interesting case." "That's the one!" exclaimed Dowager Lady Daldberry, pointing up at the Townsend's grandmother. "How delightful to give it back to you, Jimmy. You were always so kind to me, so very kind." And she wandered back to the drawing room. "The steps, Whistler," said Billingham, "unless you'd like to jump up and fetch it yourself, Mr. Townsend." Later than expected, Jimmy and Tilly were given their envelope by the inscrutable MacBain. Then, as they had missed the last train to town, Lance was deputed to drive them back to Chiswick. On Christmas Day, Tilly and Jimmy's grandmother got a jolly decent surprise present. That spring, Johnny married his sweetheart, and the house had a new stair carpet. 2 years later, following an investigation by Inspector Billingham's team, a proportion of the Townsend's family fortune was returned, by which time it wasn't needed. The Townsend Benevolent Fund for the Encouragement of the Performing Arts amongst young people was established with the proceeds. The final Christmas Eve performance at Daldberry Hall had taken place. The ballroom curtains were closed for good. Still